Just recently, on April 29th, David Barton and First Liberty Institute's Matt Krause testified before the Texas House of Representatives Committee on Public Education. They were there to support a bill which would require the Ten Commandments to be posted in every Texas classroom. Barton's testimony was similar to what he says whenever he advocates for the Decalogue in the schools. Here's part of what he told the Texas Senate Education Committee in 2023.
In the Bladensburg case, that the new standard will be, if it's traditional, historical, it's going to have a presumption of constitutionality. And so what I want to do, we have about 160,000 items out of American history, but this is the first textbook ever printed in America. It was done in 1690 in Boston. It was used into the 20th century, so it's through 5 different centuries that it appears. And it's interesting that in this textbook, there are 43 questions on the Ten Commandments. So this is what we used in the 20th century, and just examples of that.
And Mr. Chairman, I just want to interrupt you and make sure everybody understands. Those are the original documents that you're holding up there, not copies.
And for the record, state your name and your position on the bill for us.
Yeah, excuse me. David Barton, wall builders in favor of the Ten Commandments bill.
Thank you.
As I described it in the first episode of this series, Barton's presentations are often part amateur historian and part antique roadshow. In essence, Barton and Krause said they believed posting the Ten Commandments was constitutional and would serve an educational purpose. Texas State Representative John Bryant wasn't convinced by their defense of the bill, nor of their arguments that the bill was educationally good for all students. Here's John Bryant.
We're a nation of all kinds of people, all kinds of faiths. And in order to hold it together, we have a constitution which makes some rules. The basic idea is whatever we pay for with our tax money, all of us together, that money is not used to raise up one person's religion over another person's religion. Yet this bill says, to come to another question that was raised earlier, with regard to are we forcing anything, a public elementary or secondary school shall display in a conspicuous place in each classroom of the school a durable poster or framed copy of the Ten Commandments that meets the requirements of subsection B, which is the wording that I just read a moment ago. Now, we are requiring every classroom to have it. And the words come right out of the Christian Jewish Bible. And half of them are talking about God or the Lord or making one reference or another to a deity. Now, how do we ask non-Christians and Jews to pay taxes and non-religious people to pay taxes to build a building and put our words, which I revere as much as you do, on the wall of that classroom and call that fair?
Hi, I'm Warren Throckmorton, and this is the podcast series Telling Jefferson Lies. This season I want to do 2 main things. First, I want to expose false information Christian nationalists use to erode the wall of separation between church and state. Second, I want to show why I think the wall of separation between church and state was the intention of the founders and the best arrangement for the United States today. Today's episode is That's Not Fair and That's Not American. What is it called when you break one of the Ten Commandments in order to promote the display of the Ten Commandments in school classrooms? Whether intentional or not, in my opinion, the supporters of the Ten Commandments did just that recently in Texas. I want to present 2 parts of the testimony to highlight some of the problems with posting the Ten Commandments in classrooms. First, let me set the stage. David Barton of Wall Builders and Matt Krause of First Liberty Institute are testifying. In the clips that I present today, Representative John Bryant and Representative James Talarico are responding and asking questions. At issue in this first clip is the fairness of the state forcing religious scripture on non-Christian students. Representative John Bryant from Dallas makes a case that the bill is not fair to non-Christian students in his district. Listen.
And you asked or made the comment earlier that it only has God in a few places. So let me read to you what's in the bill here. It says, I am the Lord thy God. All right. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. I'll skip the next line. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thou may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Now, are you maintaining that that's not religious?
I don't believe
statement?
I ever said that I did not think the Ten Commandments were religious. I think it's inescapable that it's religious in nature. It's the very essence of it. What I was saying from a constitutional perspective is when we had the Lemon Test from 1971 to 2022, there was almost a presumption of unconstitutionality if it was religious. But
I'm
now
on the should we, not on the could we. Okay, I'm not interested in a constitutional debate here, because it will be litigated and somebody will decide it if this passes. I'm just talking about what we heard Mr. Talarico talk about, and I mentioned a little bit earlier as well, about a child in the classroom who is not a Christian or a Jew seeing on the wall Christian-Jewish scripture. That's really what's at stake here. Yeah. And the question that I previously asked Mrs. Noble, we're a nation of all kinds of people, all kinds of faiths. And in order to hold it together, we have a constitution which makes some rules. The basic idea is whatever we pay for with our tax money, all of us together, that money is not used to raise up one person's religion over another person's religion. Yet this bill says, to come to another question that was raised earlier with regard to are we forcing anything, a public elementary or secondary school shall display in a conspicuous place in each classroom of the school a durable poster or framed copy of the Ten Commandments that meets the requirements of subsection B, which is the wording that I just read a moment ago. Now, we are requiring every classroom to have it, and the words come right out of the Christian Jewish Bible, and half of them are talking about God or the Lord or making one reference or another to a deity. Now, how do we ask non-Christians and Jews to pay taxes and non-religious people to pay taxes to build a building and put our words, which I revere as much as you do, on the wall of that classroom and call that fair?
In answer to Representative Bryant's question about fairness, Matt Krause, an attorney for First Liberty Institute, an organization defending the bill, responded that the reason it's fair is because the founders based the government on the Ten Commandments.
And I think you go back to the fact that it wasn't our choice that the founding fathers used that document to build a lot of the foundational laws and structures and principles that we have. But that fact is inescapable as well. That's what they used. And I think it's good and it's right for us to remind students of those foundations of law and those foundations of society that our country was built upon. And I think it's good for them to remember that.
In other words, blame the founders for favoring Christianity over other religions. While it's tempting to respond to Krause now about the role of the Ten Commandments in forming the Constitution, I'll save that for later in this episode. For now, let me come back to Representative Bryant, who doesn't believe there is a legal or constitutional reason for posting the Ten Commandments.
I mean, let's be real with each other here. You've got a religious motive for wanting to see this on the wall.
No, as a constitutional attorney, what I want to see is a restoration of what the expressions that we used to have in this country that we lost in 1980 by a flawed test and a bad opinion by the Supreme Court. I want to get us back that status quo ante that we had for 1789 to 1980. We should get back to that because I think that was well and good.
Thank you. With all due respect, I'm not buying that. I'm thinking about the people that I represent. I represent 200,000 people like everybody else up here. Just take them. I've got every kind of person in my district. We have schools that have where there's 20 languages that are spoken there, and they're trying to get everybody to speak in English. They come in from all over the world, or their parents did. They're Americans. We have people been here generations and generations that are not Christians and Jews. And you're asking us to put Christian and Jewish language on the wall of classrooms that they paid for. That's not fair, and that's not American.
Man, that's powerful. I agree with Representative Bryant. It isn't fair, and it is not American. Elevating one person's religion over another is the opposite of the intention of the First Amendment. In his response to Representative Bryant, Matt Krause said he wanted to get back to a situation that existed before 1980. David Barton, in his testimony, said there's nothing more historical and traditional in education than the Ten Commandments. I beg to differ. According to a survey conducted by Richard Deerenfield in 1962, only 3 states either required or allowed the Ten Commandments to be posted in classrooms. Let me read Deerenfield's summary of his findings. Quote, 3 states use this device as a technique to inculcate in the students a knowledge of and respect for these spiritual laws of the Old Testament. In Minnesota, an Attorney General's opinion in 1952 permits the display of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. The Mississippi Educational Code requires instruction in the Ten Commandments. The North Dakota school laws state it shall be the duty of the school board, Board of Trustees, or Board of Education of every school district to display a placard containing the Ten Commandments of the Christian religion in a conspicuous place in every schoolroom, classroom, or other place in said school where classes convene for instruction. End quote. Posting the Ten Commandments wasn't as common as Barton and Company want you to think. The Bible was used in classrooms at various times in various places, but Christian nationalists don't tell the whole story. Christianity and the Bible in schools led to riots and protests in Cincinnati, New York, Philadelphia, and other cities around the nation. For instance, in Philadelphia on May 6, 1844, a literal battle flared between Catholics and Protestants over religion in public schools. When it was over, 20 people were dead. Is this what Barton and Krause want? Is this the past they want us to return to? The next part of the hearing I want to feature raised podcast namesake Thomas Jefferson. In this segment, First Amendment warrior Texas State Representative James Talarico revealed that he is a big fan of Jefferson and quoted him on the Ten Commandments. Listen.
The state elevating one faith tradition over the others with an official act becomes, in my view, an infringement upon that establishment clause. I did a lot of, I'm a big Thomas Jefferson fan, and was looking back through some of his writings. In 1814, he actually talked about the Ten Commandments and whether or not it's kind of has its, that it is the root of English common law, which is where we get kind of our legal system. And in a letter in 1814, he said the Ten Commandments should not be part of the common law of England because they never were. And then in a few years later, when the Virginia legislature attempted to insert Jesus Christ into the preamble of a statute, Thomas Jefferson worked to defeat that measure, saying, quote, religious freedom was meant to comprehend within the mantle of its protection the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and infidel of every denomination. And so, I don't think we're necessarily disagreeing. I think if we're being true to Jefferson, his writings, and his position, I think it was clear that something like this bill of the state, the government, forcing the Ten Commandments, forcing every public educator to display it in their classrooms, whether it violates the letter of the law, certainly violates the spirit of the law. And I think that's my overall concern. Again, not to or to Chairman Frank's point, not saying that we shouldn't have religion in the public square, that we can't have a prayer service in a government building. I'm not saying that. There may be some people out there saying that. I'm not one of them. My concern is when the government starts to pick and choose between religions. And it's not only a danger to the state and to democracy, it's also a danger to the church. And I think you just said, I think someone said that about the Danbury Baptists and Baptists in general, historically being very concerned about when the state usurps the role of the church or usurps the role of the pastor or clergy, because that's honestly who I want teaching the faith. I don't want government employees teaching my faith. I don't trust government employees to do that job. And I think it's really important that we honor the role of the church in that relationship of church and state. But thank you for your comments.
Talarico's comments came at the end of testimony from Matt Krause and David Barton. Talarico wanted to clarify his views about the founders, and specifically the point about Jefferson and common law. He correctly noted that Jefferson did not accept the common notion of his day that Christianity was the basis of English common law. More about that shortly. Hearing Talarico's comments about Jefferson triggered Barton to draw on his inner Jefferson lies. At that point, Barton jumped in with a quick recitation of some of the best hits from his book on Jefferson that was pulled from publication by Thomas Nelson. The first half of last season's podcast told that story. It really is must listening. Anyway, I want to play what Barton told the House Committee about Thomas Jefferson and then summarize what Michael Coulter and I had to say about them in our book, Getting Jefferson Right. I've shortened and streamlined some of this for the podcast format. First, the Capital Church story.
It is interesting, for example, that we have in the records of Congress on December the 4th, 1800, when they moved into the brand new Capitol building. They have been in the other cities of Philadelphia and New York. Now they've inhabited the Capitol building. It is Jefferson who proposes that they have church service every Sunday in the Capitol, and he says the House of Representatives. He then goes as president 3 months later when he's elected. He goes for 8 years, and he often invites the speakers in the Capitol at the church.
Barton says Thomas Jefferson is the person who proposed to have church at the Capitol. If we can believe the records of Congress, that's not true. Listen to the entry in the records of Congress on December 4th, 1800. Quote, "The Speaker informed the House that the chaplains had proposed, if agreeable to the House, to hold divine service every Sunday in their chamber." End quote. That's it. Apparently it was agreeable to the representatives since there was no recorded objection or vote on the matter. On December 4th, 1800, Jefferson was indeed vice president and as such president of the Senate. The Senate, however, did not need to approve the matter since the request was to use the House chamber. I can find no evidence of a vote, affirmation, or acknowledgement by the Senate of this policy. According to the records of the Senate that same day, nothing was mentioned about the use of the Capitol building as a church. According to these records, Jefferson did not note his views on the House's decision. Even though Barton claims that Jefferson proposed to hold church in the chamber, there's no record he had any involvement. Barton's correct that Jefferson did attend services, although not as frequently as Barton says. In any case, the main claim was an exaggeration. There's no evidence Jefferson had a hand in the initiation of services at the Capitol. Next.
And it's also in 1803, and we have the actual treaty where that he used federal funds to send missionaries to the Kaskaskia Indians.
Barton says Jefferson signed a treaty to use federal funds to send missionaries to evangelize the Kaskaskia Indians. First of all, that's not what happened. And second, it isn't the First Amendment gotcha that Barton thinks it is. Jefferson had a policy of getting Indian tribes in debt, so they would need to sell their land in exchange for paying off that debt. This happened with the Kaskaskia tribe. In their case, their numbers had decreased, and they didn't need as much land to live on. To address their debt, they ceded basically all of Illinois to the federal government. In exchange, the government forgave their debt, allowed them a portion of the land, agreed to build a Catholic church for them, and pay their priest. What you have to understand is that the Kaskaskia Indians were mostly Catholic converts. Listen to the relevant part of the treaty. And by the way, Barton isn't the only one who has a copy of the treaty. Quote, "The United States will also cause to be built a house suitable for the accommodation of the chief and the said tribe, and will enclose for their use a field not exceeding 100 acres with a good and sufficient fence. And whereas the greater part of the said tribe has been baptized and received into the Catholic Church, to which they are much attached, the United States will give annually for 7 years $100 toward the support of a priest of that religion, who will engage to perform for the said tribe the duties of his office, and also to instruct as many of their children as possible in the rudiments of literature. And the United States will further give the sum of $300 to assist the said tribe in the erection of a church." End quote. The United States gave money toward a church building and provided a stipend for a priest to continue work already begun, which included both religious and non-religious duties. The tribe was already attached to the Catholic Church. It's inaccurate to say that the federal government sent missionaries to evangelize the Indians. The government provided financial support for a limited time to support a priest already working with this group for religious and educational purposes. It's also important to remember that the tribes were generally considered sovereign nations. Indians didn't become citizens in the United States till 1924. Thus, there really isn't a separation of church and state issue. The Kaskaskia were not citizens, and the tax dollars were paid to get land. There were few, if any, First Amendment issues raised by this treaty. The priest and the church were in essence bargaining chips in a land deal. Next.
It's also in 1805 that he writes the plan of education for Washington, D.C. public schools, in which Jefferson placed the Bible and Isaac Watts' hymnal as the two reading books for students in school.
Jefferson was elected by the City Council of Washington, D.C. to their school board in 1805. He accepted the position in a letter to Board of Education Chairman Robert Brent, and at the time told Brent he would, quote, "willingly undertake the duties proposed to me so far as others of paramount obligation will permit my attention to them," end quote. In other words, being president had to come first. Barton says that Jefferson authored the plan of education which used the Bible and Isaac Watts' hymnal. There is a source that can clear this up. J. Ormond Wilson was the first superintendent after Jefferson. He wrote a history of the D.C. schools. In that history, he wrote that he did not know who authored the plan of education, but he suspected Jefferson did. Here is his description of the plan authorship. Quote, "A notably comprehensive report setting forth in detail the plan of the entire educational system from an academy to a university was prepared by a select committee and adopted September 19, 1805. Mr. Jefferson's early and liberal contribution in money and his accepting and holding the offices of trustee and president of the Board of Trustees of Public Schools so long as he resided here show his personal interest in their establishment, and the fact that he had several years earlier proposed a quite similar plan of education for the state of Virginia, and a few years later, in 1817, vigorously renewed his proposal, make a strong probability that he himself was the chief author of the first plan of public education adopted for the city of Washington." End quote. Wilson said there was a, quote, "strong probability," end quote, that Jefferson wrote it, but he didn't know. Now for the most important part. Even if Jefferson did write the plan with his own hand, it undermines Barton's claim because Jefferson didn't include the Bible in it. Wilson's history provides a description of the 1805 plan. In their plan, the Board of Trustees said, quote, "In these schools, poor children shall be taught reading, writing, grammar, arithmetic, and such branches of the mathematics as may qualify them for the professions they are intended to follow. And they shall receive such other instructions as is given to pay pupils as the board may from time to time direct. And pay pupils shall, besides, be instructed in geography and in the Latin language." End quote. There is no mention of the Bible or a hymnal by Watts or anyone else. A little later in his article, Wilson describes some developments after Jefferson left office. Remember what I said above about Jefferson's involvement. It was only while he resided in the district. In 1812, the Washington schools switched their method to allow a district school to follow the approach of an educator named Joseph Lancaster. Then, in 1813, a report of the progress under the new educational plan was submitted. That report said students were learning to read using the Bible and Isaac Watts' hymnal. If you're keeping score of the dates, you'll see the problem with Barton's claim that Jefferson included the Bible in schools in 1805. Thomas Jefferson left the presidency and Washington, D.C. in 1809. He retired to Monticello. No longer a president or a member of the D.C. School Board. This 1813 report summarized the work of one school, which was implemented in 1812. Barton gets a story that Jefferson included the Bible in Watts' hymnal from a report about another plan implemented in one school and submitted nearly 4 years after Jefferson left town. In short, Jefferson didn't include the Bible since he was no longer in the district and no longer involved in the school system. Now, for good measure, using the Bible in education with young students violated Jefferson's beliefs. Listen to what he wrote in his plan of education in Virginia from his book Notes on the State of Virginia. Quote, "Instead, therefore, of putting the Bible and Testament into the hands of the children at an age when their judgments are not sufficiently matured for religious inquiries, their memories may here be stored with the most useful facts from Grecian, Roman, European, and American history." End quote. In other words, no, Thomas Jefferson didn't include the Bible and Isaac Watts' hymnal in the D.C. schools. Next.
And Jefferson did say that the common law was, or Tenth Commandment's not part of the common law, but that's a series of several letters with John Adams, and he said it's not part of the common law of England. England didn't use it in the common law. He didn't say it wasn't part of America.
Now we're coming full circle, talking again about the Ten Commandments. This is a stunning admission from David Barton. Let me repeat what he said. Quote, "Jefferson did say that the common law was, or Ten Commandment is, not part of the common law. But that's a series of several letters with John Adams, and he said it's not part of the common law of England. England didn't use it in the common law." End quote. Then Barton said Jefferson, quote, "didn't say it wasn't part of America." End quote. If Barton was implying that Jefferson thought the Ten Commandments was of some consequence for American law, I have news for him. Jefferson was as vigorous an opponent of the idea that Christianity was the basis for common law as anyone could be. He never said Christianity was the basis for common law in America but not England. Talarico is generally correct. Jefferson wrote about the Ten Commandments not being part of common law in his Commonplace book, but then sent that portion of his thoughts on the matter to political supporter Thomas Cooper in 1814. Then again in 1824, Jefferson said the same thing about common law to British politician John Cartwright. Quote, "I was glad to find in your book a formal contradiction at length of the judiciary usurpation of legislative powers, for such the judges have usurped in their repeated decisions that Christianity is a part of the common law. The proof of the contrary, which you have adduced, is incontrovertible, to wit, that the common law existed while the Anglo-Saxons were yet pagans, at a time when they had never heard the name of Christ pronounced, or knew that such a character had ever existed. Now, stay with me here. He's basically saying that the Anglo-Saxons had never heard of Christ, and they still had common law, long before they ever heard his name pronounced. Furthermore, Jefferson had no interest in the Ten Commandments. It's unbelievable to me that Barton would say anything about Jefferson in the Decalogue. In a letter, Adams had asked Jefferson if he had ever thought about where the Ten Commandments came from. Here's what Jefferson replied, quote, "Nor did the question ever occur to me before, where got we the Ten Commandments? The book indeed gives them to us verbatim, but where did it get them? For itself tells us they were written by the finger of God on tablets of stone, which were destroyed by Moses. It specified those on the second set of tables in different form and substance, but still without saying how the others were recovered. But the whole history of these books is so defective and doubtful that it seems vain to attempt minute inquiry into it. And such tricks have been played with their text and with the text of other books relating to them, that we have a right from that cause to entertain much doubt what parts of them are genuine." End quote. Whether in England or America, it was all the same for Jefferson. So back to Matt Krause's contention that the Ten Commandments were so influential that we must put them on the school walls. Jefferson didn't think so. John Adams wasn't sure the Ten Commandments we have were the right Ten Commandments. They weren't cited once during the Constitutional Convention. Of course, the Ten Commandments are important to Christians and Jews, and they have their rightful place in religious history. But singling them out for display in public schools is blatant favoritism of Christianity. I agree with Representative Bryant. It isn't fair, and it isn't American. I'm guessing that the Ten Commandments bill has a pretty good chance of passage in the Texas legislature. Supporters of the Ten Commandments in schools say there is an educational purpose for it. One problem with that is that advocating for the law has already led to bad history, which can't be good for education. I think all that's going to happen is that people will keep on breaking the Ten Commandments, believing false history, and people will keep on fighting about it. If you want more debunking and fact-checking, have I got a book for you. Much of this material came from Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about Thomas Jefferson. You can get it on Amazon.com. Make sure you get the third edition, though. You can get it via Kindle or an Audible version as well. Today's music was provided by Earl's Taco Shack, Jeremiah Lawson, and Jonas Fair. I am finishing up a book project right now that's scheduled to come out next year. I'll be working on that the rest of the month, and for that reason, the podcast will be on a break until June, when the second half of the season will commence. If you like the podcast, please tell your friends. Thanks for listening.